Hello, welcome. Thanks so much for being here. If you're joining us, please feel free to put into the chat where you're joining us from. Hi, Tessa. It's great to see you all here. My name is Deepa Iyer, and I am with the Building Movement Project and Solidarity Is. And this is an Instagram Live where we are focusing on the social change ecosystem framework. And today we're going to be talking about a role called the storyteller role. And so I want to welcome everyone for being here. We're going to get started very shortly. Just want to give folks some time to be here. Thank you for joining us. And if you are not familiar with the social change ecosystem framework, I encourage you to learn about it, to work with it, and to understand how you can include it and apply it into your own life. So very quickly, the social change ecosystem framework is a tool and an approach for folks who are interested in being really effective on your social change journey. And it's not just for individuals, it's also for organizations, for networks and coalitions, for movements even. And before I start talking about the role of the storyteller and invite Taz to join us in a conversation, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the social change ecosystem framework. We'll also be dropping some links into the chat as well. So very quickly, the social change ecosystem framework is comprised of 3 parts. So the first part is an opportunity to really identify what our core values are. And if you have the social change ecosystem framework in front of you, you'll find those core values at the hub or center of the framework. There are some ideas there for certain values, and you are obviously welcome to add your own. The second aspect of the social change ecosystem framework is actually to identify the roles that really align with your values and with whatever issue you are hoping to get more involved in. The framework invites us to think about 10 roles, and they range from builder to frontline responder to visionary to experimenter to storyteller, which is the role that we're going to be talking about today. These aren't job titles, they're roles. So they're basically how we show up in social change spaces and what our skills and strengths and aspirations are as well. And then the third aspect of the framework is that it is all about understanding that we are interconnected, that we're part of an ecosystem. So we rely on each other, we depend on each other, and we know that we don't have to play all of the roles as individuals or organizations because we're connected to other people who share our values and who are coming in to play particular roles as well. I think that one of the ways folks have used this framework in particular was last summer during the uprisings that we saw all across the country in response to anti-Black racism, where there were, of course, frontline responders and disruptors who were on the streets, who were organizing vigils and rallies and protests. And then there were others who could not perhaps be out there on the streets because of the pandemic or other circumstances. And they chose to be caregivers, taking care of the disruptors. They chose to be storytellers, documenting what was happening on the streets. And so in this way, we saw an ecosystem emerge where multiple people, multiple organizations played different roles, all in order to advance shared values and goals. So I hope you'll work with the framework. We'll drop the link in so you can find a reflection guide on our website at buildingmovement.org. You'll get access to the framework, to definitions of the roles, and to a guide where you can actually take some questions to understand what is your role, what is your aspirational role, and how are you strengthening your capacity and muscle to play those roles as well. And if you'd like a deeper dive, if you would like a training or a workshop, please reach out to us at Building Movement Project. Our information is in our link tree here, as well as on my Instagram at Deepa V. Iyer. So that's just a quick overview of the social change ecosystem framework. And as I mentioned, we're doing these monthly IG lives for folks to learn more about each of the roles. And if you are just joining us, welcome. And I would love to know where you're coming in from, where you are right now, as well as what is the role that speaks to you, right? What are you trying to experiment with? What role do you want to play, or do you play often or are called to play? So please share that in the comments so we get a sense of what this ecosystem looks like as well. So I want to start by, as I always do on these IG Lives, start by sharing a little bit about the role that we're talking about, right? Which is the storyteller role. And then I'm going to invite into conversation with me someone who plays that role so well and so effectively to share a little bit about their process and what they've learned about playing this role. So today we're talking about the storyteller role, and I think this is one of the roles that many of us are actually familiar with, right? Perhaps more so than any of the other roles even. And that's because human beings have been sharing stories since the beginning of time. It's the way that we communicate with each other. It's the way we preserve our histories. It's the way that we dream and reveal our possibilities. And storytellers do this time and again for us. And particularly, I think, with communities of color whose histories are often erased or not told on purpose or even bent, right? Storytellers can actually get to the heart of what is the truth of the histories that communities have faced and what are the futures and possibilities that they aspire to. So we can find storytellers in all mediums, right? Poets, artists, people who are painting community murals, people who are using theater and on-stage activities from dance to stand-up comedy to plays in order to share messages, people who are using film to document and archive. And so all of these are ways in which storytellers who are committed to social change are actually transforming our communities and playing a role in that ecosystem. A few examples of storytellers I'll quickly mention that I think of when I think of storytelling and social change. And I love the fact that folks are putting information into the chat about who they are, and also seeing some friends and familiar faces join, which is always wonderful. But also feel free to share storytellers that inspire you. A few that I wanted to share quickly are when I think about the intersection of social change and storytelling, I think about people like Anna Deavere Smith, whose play Twilight Los Angeles documented the 1992 LA uprisings and really blended journalism and actually taking the stage to tell stories. I think of organizations like the Center for Story-Based Strategy, which looks at popular education and campaigns and narrative and blends those with storytelling. I think of the Densho Project, which is an online platform that documents the testimonies of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. And I think about storytellers like Dilo, a Sri Lankan American actor and comic who uses stand-up comedy to explore issues at the intersection of race, being a person of color, and being transgender. So these are all just some examples of how folks use storytelling to document histories, to share future possibilities, and to really unearth and disrupt stereotypes and tropes and the like. So there are lots of ways in which storytellers show up in terms of advancing social change, and we'll talk more about that. And in the chat, feel free to share storytellers that inspire you. If you are a storyteller yourself, please let us know how we can learn more about your work as well. So with that, I'm so excited to dive into the role of the storyteller a little bit more with my dear friend and movement sister, Taz Ahmed. Let me bring Taz into our conversation. So as Taz is coming into our conversation, I wanted to share with you a little bit about Taz. And again, hi, Taz.
Hi, can you all hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm in LA. I'm gonna move my camera just a bit. I realize there we go. I'm in LA right now. It's nice outside. It rained this weekend. I'm good. I'm doing all right.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to give you a proper introduction. So because I want folks to know about you. So, Taz, and I love this because Taz's bio is perfect. The first line of Taz's bio is that Taz plays at the intersections of pop and politics, and that's such a great way of explaining what Taz does. And Taz does this in so many different mediums. So, if you're interested in reading Taz's poetry, you can find that in a recent grief poetry collection that Taz has curated and written in. You can also listen to her on the Good Muslim, Bad Muslim podcast that she co-hosted for 5 years. You can get a hold of her popular Muslim Valentine's Day cards or her artwork, like this one that she made for me.
Oh, you have it handy. Thank you.
Of course, I am prepped with my props. And this one is called Aunties with Deadly Stare, and it's a way of disrupting and subverting the trope of the ideal South Asian woman, and we'll hopefully get into that a little bit more. And Taz brings a lens of social change and power building to all of this work, right? Because she's actually not someone who's apart from movement spaces. She's been in them. She's been active for 2 decades now in Asian American spaces, from South Asian American Voting Youth, or SAVI, which is how we met way back in 2004.
2004. Oh my God.
To 18 Million Rising and many other spaces like that. So welcome, Taz. Thanks for joining.
No, thanks so much for having me. I love talking about this stuff, so I'm ready to discuss and get in.
Yes, thank you. And for folks who are joining us, please feel free to ask us questions, ask Taz questions. If you are a storyteller yourself, we'd love to know where we can find your work and how you actually advance social change through storytelling. So Taz, at the beginning of the IG Live, I talked a little bit about the ways in which storytellers are creating and preserving our histories and dreaming up our futures. And the first question I have for you is, when did you realize that you are a storyteller?
I mean, this is like one of those things I was thinking about where I feel like everyone is a storyteller. I'm Bengali, so I feel like that's a big part of our narrative too, is that everyone's a storyteller. But I think this idea of storyteller in this social change ecosystem map, that I really started thinking about when I was doing Savvy. When I was doing Savvy, I was, this young, 21, 22-year-old activist that was trying to talk to brown people to go vote, and they just would not listen to me when I wanted to register them to vote. And I realized that I needed to incorporate storytelling and incorporate something pop culture, make it fun and make it not so boring. And so that really got me on this path of how do we make things exciting? I mean, I guess this is marketing also, but it was a lot of how do we talk about our activism history? How do we talk about our community? How do we talk about what it means to be brown and tie that into politics? So then I went to grad school and I got my master's degree in public policy at UCLA, and I focused it on critical race theory. And back then, I mean, now CRT is like a hot topic everywhere, but back then we didn't have it as a concentration. I had to make it as we didn't have a CRT class in the School of Public Affairs, so we had to do a student-led course. We had to teach each other. We had to create our own textbook for it. It was a little mind-blowing now, seeing how much culture shifted. But anyways, in that class, a big part of it was learning about counter-narratives and learning about the importance of telling stories, community stories, to empower our community. And another part of it was the marginalization of our histories and how the erasure of our history is tied to our oppression. So those were 2 big things I was thinking about. In that, at the same time I was in grad school, I was also writing for a very popular blog called Sepia Mutiny.
Sepia Mutiny, yes.
Yeah. And I was a guest blogger for a month, and then I just kind of stayed on. And it was so constructive to my development as a culture maker to be on this site where we were told to write about anything brown. I was the one that was writing about Muslim brown issues or political brown issues. And I was tying that into like my learnings of understanding counter narratives and history for our community. And that is it. That's what shaped me. Because I was like, no one, like, CP Mutiny was doing such crucial work. And now I feel like it feels so silly because there's so many brown sites now. There's so many brown storytellers and activists. But at that time, it was 2008. It was like, you know, right after 9/11. It was so necessary at that time. And that's how I, you know, am on the path today, because I just realized how important knowing our history was, knowing who's telling the stories of our community, making this kind of information accessible to people, using that to like move people, change people. And that's hopefully what I've been trying to incorporate into everything that I do now. But it's been manifesting in different tactics. Yeah. The value has been pretty consistent.
Yeah, and I want to talk about those, you know, more recent pieces of work that you're doing, but I'm so glad that you talked about, you know, your points of entry into storytelling, and also recognizing that, like, you had the academic class, you had, you know, obviously, like, I think like the way that you grew up, right, where we do, I think in many families and communities, storytelling is how we actually connect with each other. And then mentioning Sepia Mutiny, and for folks who might not know, I don't know if it's still archived somewhere.
It's archived, yeah.
Okay. So it's, you know, one of the two, like, the go-to places, right? I remember in that time where if you wanted to understand anything about South Asian America, that's, you know, I remember checking it every morning. I was at SALT at the time, and I would always check it because it would give me the pulse of what was happening in the community.
Yeah.
So it was another way of documenting kind of current situations that were happening, which a lot of newspapers weren't covering, or the media didn't really cover at all. So thank you for sharing like your points of entry, but also reminding me of how much you've contributed to like the South Asian American documentation that we need to keep in mind. So tell us a little bit, and for those who are joining, we're talking about Storytellers with Taz Ahmed. We're talking about the social change ecosystem framework, how you blend storytelling and social change. And if you are a storyteller, let us know. If you have questions for Taz or me, put them in the chat, please. One question I do have for you is, you talked about values of being connected to community. But another question I have is, what about, you know, the strengths? You said everyone's a storyteller, and I think that's true, but I also think that there's certain strengths and skills and ways of being, you know, that storytellers have. What are some of those skills and strengths that you lean on for your own work that you could share with us?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's a little complicated, I guess. I will say that, like, one of the things that I learned in my career, like on CP Muni, I was really careful to not write about my personal issues because we had a lot of trolls, and I would get attacked for being Muslim on that site. And I was just like not sure how to navigate that, which this also feels like a silly conversation because I think society has changed so much to be more vulnerable. But I do think that being vulnerable for me was a very conscious step. I became vulnerable when I did the chapter for Love Inshallah, which is the secret love lives of American Muslim women that came out in 2011. And I got so much like emails from young South Asian girls who were just like, oh my gosh, the story was amazing. And I really just saw the power of vulnerability and the power of telling your personal narrative to highlight like political issues or what was going on in society. So vulnerability was like my number one thing that I walked away from, where I was just like, okay, this is the thing that like is resonating. This is how you touch hearts. You can be as intellectual as you want, but it's not going to touch their hearts. And I have a poem that I perform now about voting. And you know, I have this like 20-year history of doing voting work, and I'll speak on panels and people will just listen. And then I'll read the poem, and then they'll start crying. And then they'll like actually understand what I'm trying to say. And I don't know if it does sound like a little manipulative saying it now to you, but I do think it makes a difference. Vulnerability makes a difference. Like when you're vulnerable and people hear that aspect of your story, then they're more willing to change what's going on in their brain about what's happening in society. And so that's where I'm coming from. And I do think I've seen a big growth in movement work doing that. So I think now there's like another conversation happening about like pulling back, like trauma porn, right? Like how much of your trauma are you putting out there to try to, you know, get people to pay attention to you? And so I think there is a fine line between making BIPOC spaces trauma porn for white people so that they can feel something versus like sharing your vulnerability so that you can connect with people who are like-minded. So it's a fine line of, and I think it's something that people often are navigating, but it is something that works, and we know that it works. We just need to figure out a way to do it in a way where, in a safe way where boundaries are in place and people don't feel they're putting their life on the line.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you saying that. And I don't think it's, you know, contrived at all. I think that that's the heart, I think, of storytelling, because you have to have an emotional resonance with someone else, right? And so in order to do that, a lot of storytellers do like pause it and start with their own stories or their own experiences in order to create that connection, and then zoom out to what it means for like an entire community or a movement. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up. And it also reminds me that it's not easy to do that. You have to, as storytellers, you have to be ready for critique. You have to be ready for people saying, you're just doing this for attention, or people actually even questioning your own story, you know, whether it's like actually true. So I feel like you have to, another kind of practice I'm hearing you talk about beyond vulnerability is kind of the building that safe space for yourself where you feel comfortable enough to be vulnerable. And I'll talk a little bit later. I want to hear a little bit more about like who is part of your ecosystem as well. And again, welcoming people to add questions or feedback or your own experiences into the chat. We're talking about the storyteller role, part of the social change ecosystem framework with Taz. So I want to ask, and thank you, Amy, for saying that you love this conversation. So thank you, Taz. I need more storytellers in my day-to-day movement work of confidence to put myself out there, but I tend to skip storytelling about my own experiences. So that really speaks to, you know, developing this sense of vulnerability. Maybe you could share that while I ask you the next question, like how you build that muscle. Because the next kind of question I want to ask you is, when you're telling a story, right, whether it's documentation of community history, or as I showed folks with this wonderful piece of art you made for me, you can commission Taz, by the way, to make this, I think still. Okay, awesome. Yes, I see that. When you do these pieces, when you make art, what changes? What changes for you, and what changes for a community? What is the transformation point?
Wow, I don't know if I've stepped away from art making to know what that is for me. Like I feel like I'm really close to it. I think it depends on the medium. I think you're holding up my visual art. For me, visual art is what I consider myself a writer that paints. I paint when I don't have the words, when the words are stuck. So then that's when I lean on painting. So painting for me is a little bit more meditative. I like to, for my visual art, I like to draw on cultural inspiration. Like I like to draw on Bengali stuff a lot. Like I like to use, it's my way of exploring my personal history and like trying to figure out how to pull that into my visual art. And I also love paper ephemera, which is tied to my love of like history. So I love being able to put paper collage into my artwork, and that's for me is like a form of documentation and art history, and like documenting our community's history in that kind of a way. So that's like that. But then like for my Muslim Valentine's Day cards, I am very much about like, I go into it very intentionally trying to make people uncomfortable. So I come up with these cards which are punny, and they draw on like the politics of the year, and I want people to laugh, but I also want people to laugh uncomfortably, and I want people to like like challenge their personal ideas of why they're uncomfortable. And I think that's a really powerful tool of that kind of art making, disruption art making, because I want people to like, I think laughing makes people vulnerable. Like people are like, let their guard down, and then they're laughing, and then they're like, oh my God, I shouldn't be laughing at this. This is so wrong. And I think I like making people feel like that. Like I think that's a form of activism in that laughter.
Can you share, not to put you on the spot, but can you share an example of one of the cards? I mean, if you were, not that you don't have to have it in front of you, or maybe you do, or if you could just share one of this. I guess you do have it. Okay.
Yeah, I do. So this year's is this showing it backwards? This is Let's Quarantine Together. This is Eat the Rich Than Me. This is You Must Be a Gin Because You're a Smoke Show. Less political on that one. Yeah. My favorite position is mutual aid. Guess I gotta break my fast because you're looking like a snack. That one's less political. I'll show you a big stimulus package. So that was this year's set. Like, and so I keep thinking I'm like too old to be making like cards like this, and then everyone's like, "What?" But then the news keeps happening. Like there's something like happening in the news. I'm like, well, that could be a great card. It's like I'm way too old for this. At the same time, the news has to stop giving me material to work.
Keep doing it, please. I think people like what you're doing. You're getting your claps. So the points of transformation for community include disrupting stereotypes or tropes, making people uncomfortable, thinking again, thinking perhaps about the news and sort of their vantage point of it. Are they hearing the complete story? And then, of course, it's documenting community history where people feel included, where they feel seen, where they feel like they're part of, they don't see themselves anywhere else, right? Like, so it's not in the textbook. It's not necessarily in film. So how do they see themselves represented in art? Can you share also about the Aunties with Deadly Stare and sort of why that's also a way of disruption?
Yeah, the Aunties with Deadly Stare was a personal project. I didn't really create that for external consumption. Talk about how you, because I believe you started it because it was about seeing aunties being profiled, right? Is that? Yes, it was an idea that I had when in 2016 I believe Muslim women who were covered got on a JetBlue plane, and they were kicked off of the plane because they were the flight attendant said they were staring too hard. And I was like, that's just kind of how aunties stare. Like, we've all been the victim of an auntie stare down where they're just like critiquing you. And then I just thought it was so being brown on a plane has been an ongoing topic of so much of my artwork. We did like a joint poem out here in LA around the Inshallah, when someone got kicked off the plane for saying Inshallah. So then we made this like paper plane that we try to sneak onto airplanes of poems, that like a joint 17-person poem. It's like, it's like, so like I have so many poems about it. I have so many stories about it, so many like activism projects about it. This is just like another one, but then I think it's just funny because it's like it's either words or it's like a can of soda. There's so many objects which make us a threat. And here it's not even an object. It's like they just stared, and that was enough to intimidate. So I just wanted to like take that back. Like, that stare is powerful. Yes, of course the aunties are going to stare. This is like their power, and our stares are so deadly, that it gets us kicked off of planes. So that's what started this one. And then in the back of them, I was using, like this one in particular, I was using the receipts that TSA was leaving in my bag in the 2000s. I saved that paper ephemera. So I was using that in that one. I think I used like train tickets in another one. I wanted to use paper that was paper of like travel. Like I wanted to places where we got stared at. And then now that I'm doing all these commissions, it's been so much fun because people have been interpreting these Aunties with Deadly Stares in different ways. So I've been getting different paper ephemera from different commissions. I did Vivek Bald, and he wanted the Ghadar Party newsletter in his piece. So on he did a skateboard. So on the back of his, we did like Urdu Gather Party collage and in English. For people that don't know who the Gather Party is, they're like one of our first storytellers of South Asian American storytelling. They were the activists that originated in the Bay Area in the 1912s to the 1925s, who were part of India's independence. So they all came here. There was a house. There was so much revolution organizing happening around their newsletter. So they had this printing press. They would make these newsletters. They were so scared when they would go back to India that the printing press would be, the paper would be confiscated, that they would memorize their newsletters and they would say it verbally. And I feel like that's such a powerful, that was powerful for me to hear that.
I love that. Yeah.
I love that too.
And Vivek Bald, for folks who are interested, has written many books, but one of the ones that I always go back to is called Bengali Harlem, where he tells stories about South Asian migrants who came to different parts of the U.S., like New Orleans or Harlem, and settled there, where you think mainly of the West Coast, but he tracks folks coming into other parts of the country. So that's great. So thank you for that. So yeah, I mean, it's so many different ways in which you are playing with various mediums to document stories, but also to disrupt stereotypes. And I love this part about making people uncomfortable, because I think that is a way of also connecting with social change as well, and being a disruptor, right? Like you're a storyteller who also disrupts. So if folks have questions for Taz or about the social change ecosystem framework, please feel free to put them into the chat. But I have some more questions. One of the questions I have for you, Taz, is sort of, so we talked about your work, and we've talked a little bit about the values as well as, you know, the skills, the importance of being vulnerable. But when you're doing work that's connected to social change, say that you, and it doesn't just have to be you could zoom out and talk about storytelling broadly, but when storytellers are documenting a community's history, right, through film or through painting or theater, what is their responsibility in terms of how they tell the story in its authentic form, but also maintaining their creative independence? How do they navigate, you know, things like getting consent before telling a story? Can you share some of that?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost one is for all artists out there that are starting something new, know that it's not new. Someone's done it before. I'm saying this especially because there's like Hyphen magazine has been there for years, and yet we see this new media company that just started called Hyphen. People were making a podcast about Vincent Chin without reaching out to the Helen Zia, who's the holder of that information now. Like, there's all these people that are trying to create new content without understanding that the people that made the content before are still alive, and you should be reaching out to them before you do that. So that's first and foremost. Like, do your work, do your history, reach out to the people that have done this before. And in addition to that, there is history. I think so much of what I'm really tired of is that like people are saying like, oh, I didn't know Asian American activism existed. And like, as someone who's been in this space for 20 years and has been part of so many different like history-based activism projects. I was part of putting together the Radical History Timeline for Bay Area Solidarity Summer 10 years ago, and it's a curriculum we still use today and that we've been building on. So like, when people tell me that like this stuff doesn't, that they're the first to discover it or that they didn't know it existed exists, just do your research. We have the internet now. Like, you don't have, like, this isn't like in the back, you know, when I was a kid, we didn't have the internet to like be able to do the research. Now there's so many books. Like, do your research. Like, it's not brand new anymore. And we can't keep shaping the narrative as if it's brand new, because that's still putting us at the starting line. Like, we're actually like in the middle of this. And if we keep pretending like we're at the beginning of the movement, then we're always going to be like 10 steps back, because we're actually like right in the middle of it, and we need to like act as if we're in the middle of it, and we need to hold that kind of power. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think this is like a big struggle that I've been seeing happening in the movement. Like, I don't like that we have to keep pretending like we're starting off brand new. Like, everyone should know that the Japanese have been interned. It's not a new topic. Now let's talk about like, what's the next step to that? The next step for me is like the vigilant love narrative of like, okay, the Muslim and Japanese community in LA are organizing together on different issues. You know, like we need to advance our narrative.
Yeah,
I didn't answer your
it
question.
totally, no, Taz, it totally makes sense, because I think what you're also talking about is like understanding that there's a continuum of movement building, right? That we are, and I love what you said, we're in the middle of the storyline, because it reminds us that there is this rich history that we can draw on. Like you talked about the Ghadar Party, for example, right? And many other movements that have come since. And then also to advance it. So we're not always starting where we were. So I think that's a really important point. And I see how storytelling can be a way to do that, to kind of remind us of our history, but also to remind us that we're in the, I love this phrase, in the middle of the storyline, in the middle of the movement, so we can see like what the future is. And I appreciate that example you gave as well. And again, yeah.
Oh, I really love like when everything was happening with the social uprising a couple years last summer. Like the story that I kept going back to was the Bellingham race riots of 1907, which happened in Washington State. And that was a riot that happened at the paper mills up there, which was largely the workers were Indian, South Asian workers. And they were raced out of town by white laborers who said that the brown people were stealing their jobs. So it was like this huge race riot. And like the narrative I was hearing last year was like, oh, this is not a South Asian, like South Asians aren't a part of this conversation. I was just like, we're 100 years a part of this conversation. Like we were part of literally a race riot in 1907, 100 years ago. So I think that was like a little bit of my frustration, is that like we are a part of this racial narrative conversation happening in America, and we have been for 100 years. The white patriarchal system in place tries to make us forget that and tries to like shape it in a way that they benefit, and we need to be very particular about inserting ourselves into this larger narrative.
Yeah, and it's also a way that we get pitted against other communities of color too, when we don't know that history, when we don't share that story, and talk about how we're also, I'm going to keep using your words, part of the storyline, right? And in the middle of the storyline, as opposed to being apart from it or not even involved or engaged. So I appreciate that. There's a question that came in that I wanted to ask you, which is, hold on, let me just pull it up. How do you conceive of your audience, and does it depend on the project, or is it more overarching? Thank you, Gauri, for asking that question.
Thanks, Gauri. For how do I conceive of my audience? This is also different based on the project. For Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, which was the podcast we had for 5 years, I had it with Zura Norbash. We started it right after the Serial podcast, so we kind of jumped in with a huge audience that we didn't plan on. And I don't think podcasts that start now can have that kind of luxury of having that kind of audience. So Zara came from this like comedy world where she had a lot of white audiences, and I came from this activist world where I had a lot of brown audience. So we like came together for this podcast, and then we had like a weird NPR audience that was listening to us because we got so much publicity so fast. And for that project, we had to have a sit-down conversation where we talked about what does it mean to recenter our narrative and who our audience was. Because we were getting a lot of fan mail that was like, can you please explain what halal means? Can you please explain what different like Muslim terminologies were that we were casually using? And we decided that we were not going to explain terms, that if people wanted to listen to this podcast, they had to know how to Google and do the research. This wasn't for them. We were speaking to our people, which was like other Muslim brown people who could like just jump in and like feel that sense of community. But then like other projects, like I've been like after Trump won, there was like all these like Muslims are like your neighbors. We're just as normal as person. So those projects were definitely like speaking to middle white America and like normalizing what it means to be brown and Muslim and have Muslim friends. I was like on a couple of videos that were like related to that. That is not what I want to do. I don't want to speak to middle America white people. I want to speak to brown people. I want to speak to lonely brown kids in the middle of nowhere. And I want like being on NPR is a way for me to reach that lonely brown person somehow. but I'm very particular about my audience in that way, because I'm not in the business of speaking to white people and making white people comfortable about brown people. But there, I mean, like, there are other people in the movement who will do that role for me, and that's fine. They can do that, and I will do.
Yes, we don't have to do all of it. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier about, you know, recognizing that in order to be vulnerable and sharing your own story, you're also trying to connect with a certain group of people. You're not trying to connect necessarily with audiences that are not you, right?
But I will say
yeah.
this, what was so great was after, in the podcast, when we shifted our narrative, and I mean, we didn't do shifting. We just did our conversations to each other. We just made that the normal. We got a lot of emails from white people that said, I'm listening to a conversation that I'm not privy to usually. Thank you for having this normal, like, thank you for being you, and thank you for letting me have this conversation. And I feel like there's something so critical about that kind of solidarity building, because what you're doing is, you're not dumbing yourself down for the white person. You're expecting the white person to catch up to you. Right. And that's this eavesdropping, because they were saying, I feel like I'm eavesdropping in this conversation. That it's so powerful to have solidarity, this kind of solidarity where you're eavesdropping in other communities and you're understanding and you're learning and you're challenging yourself. I think that's like something that was really powerful for me. I think we need to not dumb down our conversations. We need to have access so people can eavesdrop and level up, instead of like us dumbing down so that, you know.
Right. You don't need to cater to like the white gaze. You know, we need to enable and have these and curate these conversations such that folks are doing their own research, as you've said many times, or checking their own privileges and what they're understanding and what they're not, and then unpacking that a bit more. Yeah. So for folks who are joining, I know more and more folks are joining, which is great. Thank you so much. If we're talking about the role of the storyteller in the social change ecosystem framework with Taz Ahmed, who is amazing and who has, I think we're putting into the chat some links where you can find Taz's work. You can commission Taz to do work. If you are a storyteller, let us know. If you have questions for us, let us know. So we've talked so far about Taz's own points of entry into storytelling. We've talked about values and practices that storytellers who are actually advancing social change are trying to develop. We've also talked about some of the boundary setting that storytellers need to keep in mind as they are telling community story or actually collaborating with organizations or movements. And now I want to transition to talk a little bit about capacity and sustainability, which is something that is part of this framework as well. The reason that there are 10 roles, in the framework is to recognize that we don't have to, as individuals or organizations, play all of those roles, right? Even if we're called to play them or we want to play them, it is a good idea to recognize that our capacity can be limited at times. We're holding too much. We need to take a step back. We want to enable and support other folks to play the roles that we're playing, as well as learn from the others in the ecosystem. So the first question I have for you is how do you sustain yourself? And I assume it's a practice. It's an iterative practice in the role of being a storyteller. Like, what depletes you, and how do you kind of build your energy and capacity?
Ooh, that's a big, that's hard. It's a difficult question to answer. I'm going through a summer of trying not to work because I got burned out, and I don't think the movement cares for storytellers the way it needs to. I think, like, so often I've been parts of nonprofit organizations where they're just like, we can just ask this artist to donate their artistry, but then artistry is a skill set. People put in skill sets to learn that. You have to pay your artists, but we don't pay our artists enough. We don't value, like, we can value it and saying like, oh, we value this, but people actually need money to survive. So we're not valuing that. So I think that's something that I've been reflecting a lot this summer, is like, how does this movement actually take care of our storytellers and people who need to, who are spreading the message of what we're doing.
Can you share? I just want to probe that a little bit more, because I think that's really important. Also, like, what is required of movements and nonprofit spaces who are working with or partnering with storytellers? You talked about obviously like valuing folks and paying them, right? That's one thing. What are other ways in which you hope that our spaces will evolve so that they're taking care of storytellers?
Well, I mean, so when I was at 18MR, we did a few projects where we worked with artists, and I was really adamant that we pay artists. So we didn't have a lot, but we would give them like, we did like a poetry for the Muslim ban series. So we paid our poets not a lot of money. I wish we could have paid them more, but we paid them something. And I do know that like I've been invited to other projects where like where it's like a website and they're like asking for writers to donate, and they'll get publicity just for like getting published on the site, and that's not going to pay the bills. I'm also like, I went to a writing residency in March, and it was great, but it was in a white space, so there was a lot of Israeli artifacts in the house that I was staying in, which was, as a Muslim woman, like a little bit like disarming. And I just think it would be great if we had like Asian American writing residencies where the space was like catered to Asian American culture, and a Muslim person doesn't have to be scared to go into this like white space. You know, like those little things I think are what's needed. And I also think that like what's been so great about this, I mean, the pandemic was awful. I don't want to say what's so great about the pandemic, but Aunties with Deadly Stare series came out of the pandemic because I had just lost my job at 18MR. I was going through some health issues. So I was using painting as a form of meditation. And I was only able to paint because I had that time to reflect and figure out what I wanted to do next and whatever. And so that time of like, I was just talking to my friend about this yesterday. I was like, artists need that time to be bored so that they can like think and process and create. And that's so crucial. That's so crucial for creatives, but I think that's crucial for everyone. Like if you're a thinker and you're trying to be in society, you need the time to like let your mind wander and reflect versus, you know, doing something.
Yeah. So value artists, reflection spaces for folks to rest, and also imagine wildly and boldly so that they can create. And then I love this idea of, you know, more spaces where folks can feel like they can go into residency or take an artist sabbatical and actually like be connected to other people who have similar experiences. So those are all really great suggestions. So for those of us in movement work and in nonprofit spaces, those are really important to think about. And then I want to ask you another question, which is, you know, who else is part of your ecosystem? You know, as you think about your storytelling work, when I talk about the ecosystem framework, I often say that a lot of the roles complement each other. So, for example, visionaries who see sort of the North Star really work well with builders, who are the ones who are putting the scaffolding together, you know, to reach the North Star. And so similarly for you as a storyteller, what are some of the roles, and you don't have to memorize that map or anything, but, you know, what are some of the types of skill sets and people that you're drawn to that really buttress, you know, your ability to do your work better?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's been such a path because I see myself in a lot of these because professionally, I felt like I had to be, let's see, professionally, I felt like I had to be a builder and a guide, an experimenter and a weaver, right, doing civic engagement work. And I never really saw myself as like someone who was a storyteller in those spaces. I felt like I was the one coordinating the phone booths so that voters would be called. And I only have been challenging myself to be in positions where I could bring the two together probably in the past 5-6 years. And it's been difficult because I think there aren't a lot of like professional positions in the movement where you can do both. So I felt like I've had to like kind of, I've had to like juggle two sides. I thought that as an artist, like there was a point where I was like, oh, like I would talk to like professional artists, and they would tell me that I would need to choose one or another. Like I would need to be an activist or an artist. And then I decided that I looked to Fabiana Rodriguez, who is this amazing um, artist and activist. And I saw all of like the people in that culture strike space, of people who are like making visual art and doing activism. I was like, that's who I want to be. Like, I don't want to have to choose. I do know that you can do both, and I think it's important that we do both um, when we do this work. So, so the people in my life are like, I actually do find it a little difficult to be in community with people who are just artists without an activist or a community lens, because this idea of making art in a vacuum, I think, is very much like, that's very white. Like, that's a very white society to be able to have that privilege to be able to create something without having to think about community. So the people in my worlds are people who are engaged in community activism, community work. They are making art to say something about the community or for the community. They're like, people in my world are like really funny. Like, I have a lot of funny people in my life, a lot of comedians, a lot of like people who are using humor. And I don't know, like I like people who like just challenge me and like are able to have conversations on race and art. I don't know, it just,
Yeah. And you also have I know you have caregivers in your life. I smile because I notice these people who are coming in who know both of us. And I know, like, Natasha, for example, is someone who plays that role in your life and has in the past. And so it's just so hi, Natasha. It's just an example of how we rely on different people in our ecosystem to, as you say, challenge us, but also to find community with and to be in safe space with as well. And one of the things, as we're nearing the end of our conversation, I feel like we could keep talking, but I want to also respect your time. One of the things I've learned from what you've said is the importance, so many things, but one of the things that's going to stay with me is how movement spaces and nonprofit spaces can more effectively support storytellers. So if you have storytellers in your ecosystem, how can we all do that better, right? Because we desperately need storytellers right now, to actually imagine and to conceive of futures where oftentimes it feels, I know right now for many of us, extremely devastating, extremely isolating, and extremely traumatic in so many different ways, right? So storytellers are so important for us to remind us of our histories, but also where we could be headed.
Wait, if I can piggyback on that really quickly, I do a couple of projects that I tried to do that didn't, I took on minor levels, but I want to expand on, is that storytellers and artists don't necessarily know everything that's happening political. That's the role of like the weavers or the guys, those are the like people that hold that intellectual knowledge, and that the storytellers need that support from those people to tell the stories in a compelling way. And I think that like there isn't enough people just kind of like say like, oh, just go make something for the movement, but give them a helping hand, give them some knowledge, give them some political education, and then the artist can like run with it. But I do think that that connection needs to be made too. It's like artists can't be expected to be like the holder of knowledge and the holder of culture, but they can work together with other people to support them through that.
That's perfect. Yeah, I love that. Holder of knowledge and holder of culture. There have to be folks who weave and bridge and make the connections too for storytellers. So as we start to close, I want to make sure that folks know what you're working on now and how folks can engage with your work, and to get pieces like this, which I know I keep showing this piece, but I absolutely love this piece so much. And anyone who comes to my home, I actually make it a point to show them this piece. And so can you share a little bit about what you're working on and how folks can engage with you?
Yeah, I'm actually, today I am packaging paintings. I made a bunch of prints. So if you want to buy a piece of visual art, this is all very new to me because, like I said, I see myself as a writer, not as a visual artist, but I'm trying to like broaden. Go to my Etsy shop. I think you can just do Tazzy Star shop and all my prints are there. I also have a Substack. I think that's tazzystar.substack.com. My Substack is a place of experimentation this year where I'm being very particular not to write about politics. So it's been fun. It's been fun to not have that pressure. And yeah, I'm like writing. I'm trying to work on a memoir. I'm trying to work on a script. I'm trying to give myself the space to be inspired and to take a break. So that's where I'm at right now. I wish I had more, but also like I also am happy that I don't have more. This is the best way to like have a restful summer is like just like having like taking the step back in this kind of a way.
You still have a lot. You still have a
It's
lot. And one of the things that I really love about you, Taz, is, you know, over the course, I mean, we both have done a lot of work in South Asian and Asian American spaces, and you are someone that has consistently shown up, you know, over like the last 2 decades, whether it was voting and civic engagement in like 2004 to the post 9/11 work that has stretched on because there's no post 9/11, to, you know, the anti-Asian racism that folks have been dealing with this year, you and last year. I mean, you've consistently been there to make the connections, to highlight and uplift other artists, to weave together projects at the intersection of race and activism and art, and also to create your own, you know, really, I think, transformative work that disrupts, that makes people, yes, uncomfortable, but also laugh and makes people reflect. And I'm so grateful to you because you are someone who actually archives like our community histories in a way that I don't think a lot of people do. So I'm just personally grateful that you are in, you know, our ecosystem.
Oh, thank you.
Work you do, and I really hope people will support Taz's work. We'll share links, etc. And really appreciate everyone joining. Any last words?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. Yeah, I'm humbled by everything you said. Like I really have been doing this work for a long time, and it's just sometimes you just feel like, is anyone paying attention to what's happening, or is it just like, or are people just not paying attention? So thank you for paying attention. It means a lot.
Of course, yes. No, you're somebody I do pay attention to and learn from, and want to keep collaborating with.
Yes.
And so thanks to everyone for joining. So again, this has been a deep dive into the social change ecosystem framework. You can find out more, including downloading a reflection guide and information about the framework at buildingmovement.org or on our link trees at this particular Instagram or at mine, Deepa V. Iyer. If you want trainings or workshops for your organization, movement, coalition, we also do those. So please reach out to us for that. And next month in September, we'll actually be doing our Instagram live focusing on the role of the frontline responder, which is on purpose because, you know, we wanted to align it with the 20th anniversary of 9/11 as well. And speaking of, you know, history and looking back, really learn about some of the ways in which folks responded. To Taz's point, that folks have been doing this work for some time and it isn't new, right? So what can we learn from what happened 20 years ago and apply it to the movements of today and the future. So thank you, Taz. Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you to the amazing Building Movement Project team who makes this possible. And we will see you next month. Till then, be safe. Bye-bye.